We have been working our way through these objections to Christianity and giving thought to them as well as we can in short sessions. Certainly, hopefully, opening the door to do further study and thinking about these topics. What we're talking about today, like he said, is suffering and evil. The objection to God Himself. Why would I want to worship a God like this? It's typically formulated in something along those lines. If God allows evil, what kind of God is this? Or more philosophically, sometimes it's if God is all powerful and all loving and all-knowing, why does evil exist? And this is definitely not a topic that we can cover thoroughly in just one session. This is a topic people have been arguing about for, thousands of years at this point. I had the opportunity to teach a full semester class on the problem of evil and really do a deep dive into it. So certainly we can't exhaust everything that there is to say about this topic. That said, I think there is a helpful approach that we can come to this topic with, and to think about it in kind of some big picture ideas and maybe give you some ammunition, because this is probably the most frequent and common objection that skeptics will raise. And I would start by saying that at least at the ground level, suffering is, generally speaking, a result of sin. Now, we are quick sometimes to disassociate suffering and sin, and for good reason. I mean, the book of Job contains the narrative of a person who is suffering, and his friends all showed up and said, "This is because you're sinning," and they're stupid, to put it simply. They're wrong. And God says as much at the end, and the narrator said as much at the beginning. This has nothing to do with that. You might remember the man who was born blind in John chapter 9, when Jesus and his apostles approach him, and they say, "Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born this way?" And Jesus says, if I can paraphrase, "You knuckleheads, that's not what this is about at all. Something different is happening here. It has nothing to do with sin." And so why would I stand here and say that suffering is, at least generally speaking, a result of sin? Well, that's very simple. It's because what God created was not a world where suffering happened. What God created was a perfect universe with no pain and no sorrow and no sickness and no death, and we as humankind corrupted that with sin, and it brought pain and sorrow and sickness and death. And while we might want to throw blame at the doorstep entirely of Adam and Eve, we have all been more than willing participants in sin as well. We have rebelled against God more than our fair share of times. What that means is we all deserve to suffer. It was 10th century, I believe, theologian I mentioned the other day, Anselm of Canterbury, who I had to read something of his in one of the classes that I took, and I'm going to be honest, most of it was just horrific to plow through, and I hated every minute of it. But in the process of that, I came across a single sentence quote that just really made me rethink a lot of things. And this is what Anselm said. He said, "If in justice I owe God myself and all my powers, even when I do not sin, I have nothing left to render Him for my sin." If you let that sink in a little bit, what Anselm is basically saying is, by virtue of the fact that I exist, I owe God everything. God didn't have to make me. My very existence means that I owe God everything that I have and everything that I am. When I am perfect, I already owe God everything. Now, if it is the case that when I am perfect, I already owe Him everything, what is left to make atonement when I'm not perfect? And the answer is nothing that I have, because that's all due to Him anyway. He already deserves all of that anyway. If we already owe Him everything, the well is dry when we need more than that. What do we deserve in our lives? Let's be a little precise. How many of our really, 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 really good days does God owe us? Does he owe us? The answer, of course, is 0. We're not due any of the good days that we have received from the hands of God. Well, how about our somewhat good days, our generally above average days? How many of those days does God owe us? How many of our not really good but mediocre, okay, I can live with it sorts of days? How many of those days does God owe us? I mean, if we are not even owed our existence, and in our great gratitude to God for creating us, what we have done is rebelled against him, what are we owed by God? What do we deserve from the hand of God? I mean, there's a sense in which, and this is not how God treats us, and I understand that, but there is a sense in which the worst day that we have ever experienced in our life is better than we deserve. And we have the audacity to look at God when some little thing goes wrong and say, God, how could you let that happen? I think we need to get our minds around how serious sin is and how much of it we've done before we start pointing at God and saying, you should do better. I think that's something of an important starting point as we think of this issue. But as we continue to think of the connection between sin and suffering, why is it that suffering happens? What is the purpose of suffering? Is there a purpose to suffering? There are some ways in which it connects pretty directly to sin. I mean, sometimes suffering, for example, is a consequence of and a punishment for sin. We're sometimes quick to look at Job and his friends, or the man who was born blind, and disavow that relationship because the Bible does in those cases. But notice, Jesus doesn't say to his apostles, neither this man nor his parents sinned that he was born blind. This was to reveal the glory of God. And oh, by the way, no suffering ever has anything to do with sin whatsoever. No, that's not how it works. The Bible also makes it pretty clear that some suffering is a result of sin, like Nadab and Abihu, like Uzzah, like Ananias and Sapphira. Like on down the line we could go. Every time someone sins and they suffer as a result of it in the Bible, there's a direct connection between suffering and sin. In the same gospel, the Gospel of John, when he heals the lame man in John chapter 5, after he heals him, he says, stop sinning or something worse will happen to you in verse 14. You know what that means? Stop sinning or something worse will happen to you? What that means is there might be a future connection between his suffering and his sin, where that suffering is a consequence of or a punishment for sin. Or you could think just in daily life, right? Somebody decides they're going to go rob a bank. And in the process of robbing the bank, they choose the wrong one, and there's a police officer in line right in front of them or behind them or wherever he is that leads this bank robber to being shot and lying there in agony. There is a direct connection between his sin and his suffering. The person who decides they're going to be the most promiscuous person on the planet and winds up with multiple STIs and STDs, their suffering is a direct connection to their sin, and it is undeniable in those kinds of cases. And we can multiply examples all day. This is just a reality. But sometimes the connection between suffering and sin is a little bit different. It's not just that it is a punishment for sin or a consequence of sin, but it serves the purpose of purifying us from our sin so that we don't suffer anymore. This seems to be the point the author of Hebrews makes in chapter 12 when he's talking about suffering that they're enduring being heavenly discipline. That we didn't like it when we were disciplined by our earthly parents, but we came to understand that it serves a good purpose. And God shows us that he treats us as sons. We're not slaves, we're not outcasts. He treats us as sons when he disciplines us. And that suffering is designed to purify us. Or Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 1, in this salvation you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in the praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. They're being grieved by various trials for the purpose of their faith being purified like gold that goes through the fire. James chapter 1, count it joy, my brothers, when you meet various trials, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And steadfastness, let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Or you might think of Paul's thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, that he said was designed to keep him from becoming arrogant about the visions he received. And so God gave this to him, or allowed this to happen to him, and would not take it away, so that he would come to trust in God rather than boasting in himself. It's a purifying purpose that he suffers in this way. Jesus talks about a couple of tragedies in Luke chapter 13, and he says, do you think this is happening to them because they're so much worse than everyone else? No, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. You see their suffering and you learn from it. And it purifies your life when you see what has happened in these cases. Jesus in Hebrews chapter 5, in the days of his flesh, offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Even Jesus learned something through his suffering, the author of Hebrews tells us. Now, we can think about this as both positive and negative. This is discipline, and discipline happens positively and negatively, and that happens here as well. Sometimes suffering brings us to repentance or gives warning to the innocent. Sometimes suffering teaches humility or obedience or dependence. I like the way that C.S. Lewis says it in Mere Christianity. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our obedience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a dead world. You ever been there? Suffering in a way you hadn't suffered before? Or a family member suffering in some way, and suddenly your focus on God is laser sharp in a way it hasn't been in years. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And what if there was no suffering as warning in this sort of way? What if you didn't feel pain? You know, when you're in the midst of it, you think, man, that'd be nice to never feel pain. But if your body didn't register pain, it would be an absolute tragedy for your body. You have severely sprained an ankle, don't feel anything, and continue to run and jump on it as if there's nothing wrong. Not only would it never heal, it would get so much more injured over time that it would eventually have to be removed from your body. If you leaned on a hot stove talking to someone in the kitchen and didn't realize it didn't feel that awful pain that's going to take a few days to recover from, but you didn't feel it and you just continued to lean there on it and talk for 30 minutes, you'd lose your hand by the end of it. There's very much a way in which pain is a blessing to our lives because it protects us, it warns us, and it warns us of worse harm. And isn't that the case when we start to think about suffering and how it's connected to sin? Suffering warns us away from things. Suffering brings us to God. Suffering purges us from evil in our lives sometimes. And so we could think about suffering in those sorts of ways. But I'd add to that suffering sometimes is for a good that we may not have even know about. You know, to step aside from the issue of sin for a second, suffering can bring us to a good that we may or may not ever see. I've quoted Tim Keller a couple times. Here's another quote from him. He says, with time and perspective, most of us can see good reasons for at least some of the tragedy and pain that occurs in life. Why couldn't it be possible that from God's vantage point, there are good reasons for all of them? I mean, you've experienced this, I'm sure. Or if you've not personally experienced it, you've talked to someone who has. You go through some period of immense, terrible suffering. And as you look back on it 5 years later, 10 years later, whatever it might be, you find yourself thinking, I sure wouldn't want to go through that again. But I learned so much from it. I'm so much of a better person now because I endured that sort of thing. And if my finite, too fleshly oriented mind can figure some of this out, how can I possibly imagine that God can't see far more good than I could ever come up with on this side of eternity? I don't know that that means that God goes through your life and so meticulously orders it that only those things that produce something that is far better could ever happen to you. That's the sort of micromanagement I don't think God gets involved in. But certainly, at least some of the time, far greater goods come out of the suffering that happens. And Joseph catches a glimpse of this. After his brothers sell him into slavery, and then he goes through everything that happens in his time in Egypt, false accusations and imprisonment, and on down the line it goes. He says to his brothers in chapter 45, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me here before you to preserve life." And in chapter 50, after Jacob dies, when the brothers are so afraid that he's finally going to take out his vengeance, they come to him again, begging for their lives. He says in verse 20, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." There's a philosopher named Peter Kreeft who tells a story about a bear that's caught in a trap and a hunter that wants to try to help the bear. And this is, I'm sure, entirely fictitious, but it makes the point. A hunter comes across a bear that's caught in a trap, and he wants to help him out. And so he first tries to win the bear's confidence. Show it some food, I'm your friend, speak very gently to it. And from the bear's perspective, you're kind of torturing it, dangling food in its face when it's in pain, and this obnoxious baby talk that you're doing to it, or whatever it might be. And this guy is clearly my enemy. And after realizing that this isn't going to succeed, he uses the tranquilizer gun to tranquilize the bear. I'm not sure why he has a tranquilizer gun. It's just part of the story. Bear with it. Bear with it. You see what I did there? And so he shoots the bear, which, of course, now definitely makes the bear think, this is my enemy. He just shot me. But that's the only way the hunter can help it, right? And so as the bear is losing consciousness and it's no longer able to do much of anything, the hunter approaches to free the bear. But the way these bear traps work is they are locked in place, and the only way you can release it is to squeeze it past the catch point to release what's holding it locked down. And so in the bear's last moments of consciousness, he feels the hunter squeeze the trap even tighter on its leg, proving beyond all doubt whatsoever that this is my enemy. And every step of the way, the hunter is just trying to help the bear. Every step of the way, the hunter is doing everything it possibly can to make this bear's life better and not worse. And the bear can't see it. It sees taunts and attacks and more pain in spite of what the hunter's intent is. Well, why? Well, because it's a stupid bear, not a human. And it can't begin to comprehend what the hunter understands thoroughly. I would suggest to you that the difference between your intelligence and a bear's intelligence is not as big of a gulf as the difference between your intelligence and God's. And if we can look at the story and understand that the hunter is up to something good, even though the bear can't begin to comprehend it, don't you think that maybe God can be up to something good even when we can't see it? And the fact that we can see it sometimes should just give us more confidence that God is doing good things even though we don't know. The book of Job makes this point as well. Job's suffering is never explained to him, and it would probably be hard for him to see any good in what came about. I mean, this is not that it made Job's life better at the end somehow. It caused family strife. It caused death of family. It caused his physical suffering and his impoverishment and in all of it. And if God came along and said, well, you see, Satan and I were having this argument, I don't know that that explanation would have helped Job feel better at the end. I really don't. And yeah, he's doubly wealthy at the end, but he was plenty well off to begin with, and I'm sure he would have traded that extra wealth to have his kids back. But there was an unknown good that Job never saw. Job says, somewhat ironically, in Job chapter 19, I wish that my words were written down. Well, Job, you got your wish. And you know what? Job's story has been read and taught for centuries. And millions upon millions of people have found comfort and meaning and answers in reading it. Job never could have guessed the immense good that his suffering produced by being recorded as it was. And I'm quite certain that whatever I suffer in my life is never going to be inspired Scripture. But that doesn't mean that good can't come from it, even if it's not my good, even if it's not my family's good, even if it's not the life of my children. There may be good that comes from my suffering from someone that I never even meet. I'd like to think that Job was the kind of person that if you told him, you know, millions of people have been helped by your suffering, knowing that, if you had the choice, would you go through it? I'd like to think that Job's the sort of person that would say, well, I won't like it, but yeah, I'll do that. I'd like to think that I'm that kind of person too. Whether I am or not, I guess is unknowable at this point. But there is good that comes from suffering, even if we never see it. In our lives, in others' lives, whatever it may be. But there's another kind of suffering that happens too that helps us see the purpose of suffering, and that is suffering that happens at the hands of God as a manifestation of the wrath of God. The wrath of God is one of those things that I think is a misunderstood topic very frequently, which is just too big to tackle in this lesson. But I'll say this, we make a mistake when we compare God's wrath to human wrath. Human wrath happens when we lose control. Human wrath happens when we want revenge. Human wrath happens in a fit of rage. And that is nothing like divine wrath. Divine wrath is kindled at only one thing, and it's sin. God's wrath is God's constant hostility towards sin and his resolve to end it once and for all. And that's all God's wrath is. And so anytime God's wrath is poured out, it is poured out against sin. And when you realize that God's wrath is against sin and only against sin, even when it is punishment in some way, that means it's a reflection of God's love. Because God is trying to eradicate evil when he pours out his wrath. He's not trying to get vengeance. It's not that his feelings are hurt in some way. God's wrath is God eradicating evil, which means it's the manifestation of God's love. Let me share with you it's a very long quote, and I ask you to bear with it in its length, but I think it makes this point so well. This is from a Croatian theologian named Miroslav Volf in one of his writings. He says, I used to think that wrath was unworthy of God. Isn't God love? Shouldn't divine love be beyond wrath? How many people in the world do you think talk that way? That's a common objection, isn't it? God is love, and God loves every person and every creature. That's exactly why God is wrathful against some of them. My last resistance to the idea of God's wrath was a casualty of the war in the former Yugoslavia, the region from which I come. According to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed, and over 3 million were displaced. My villages and cities were destroyed. My people shelled day in and day out, some of them brutalized beyond imagination, and I could not imagine God not being angry. Or think of Rwanda in the last decade of the past century, where 800,000 people were hacked to death in 100 days. How did God react to the carnage? By doting on the perpetrators in a grandfatherly fashion? By refusing to condemn the bloodbath, but instead affirming the perpetrators' basic goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. You see, when you understand that God's wrath is the pouring out of His vengeance on evil, it must be a manifestation of His love. He's trying to purify the world. He's trying to make the world better. You can't look at those kinds of horrors and many other horrors like that have happened in human history and say, well, God's just shrugging His shoulders, doing nothing at all. Couldn't care less about it. No, that's not how God behaves. And when God isn't wrathful, I think Wolf is right. That's the kind of God we should reject. A God who isn't wrathful at this sort of thing. And so sometimes when God pours out His wrath on sin, there is suffering that happens as a result. But as we think about this also, I would suggest to you that we can find something of God's answer to the problem of evil in the text of the Bible as well. And it's not found in the place where we might most want to find it, which is the book of Job. I was speaking somewhere one time on this topic, and I was talking with someone who said, well, what are you talking about tonight? And I said, the problem of evil, basically. And he kind of looked incredulous and said, didn't Job deal with that? As if that's all there is to say about the issue is just the book of Job, which I think is a bit simplistic. But beyond that, I don't think the book of Job is primarily about the problem of evil. It comes up, of course, because there is suffering, and there is suffering that is unfair to Job. And so, the topic arises, but the book of Job really is a book about wisdom. When you look through the speeches of the friends, what you find is them arguing about who knows what the right answer is, who is wise and can teach the other ones what the truth is. And when Elihu speaks, at the end, he talks about more of the same. And at the heart of the book in chapter 28 is an entire poem that is kind of the middle of everything, which is all about wisdom and where it's found and that God has it. And when God finally speaks at the end, He asks questions about who's darkening counsel by words without knowledge. And He asks questions of Job, of what Job can do with his wisdom and his knowledge and his understanding and his discernment. He's asking Job wisdom questions. And at the end, Job says, I spoke far beyond what I knew. You see, Job is all about wisdom. And the answer in Job is God is wise and Job is not. And as it relates to the issue of suffering, the point is something along the lines of God knows what's going on. I'm in control, God says, trust me. And then there's a lot of truth in that. But I don't know that that's the greatest answer we want to receive. Now, if that's the only answer God gives, then it's sufficient because it's the only answer God gives. But it's not the only answer God gives. The real answer God gives to the problem of suffering is Jesus. Because God doesn't sit in heaven, removed from everything, looking at us and our suffering and saying, well, they're just going to have to deal with it. They brought this upon themselves. You have to suffer the consequences. That's what we do as parents a lot, right? There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Let your children suffer the consequences of their choice. I have no objection to that. But what if God had done that with us? If God just looked at us and said, well, you brought all this evil on yourself, you're just going to have to deal with it. How utterly lost and hopeless would we be? Instead, God entered the world of suffering to fix the problem. And in doing so, the worst thing ever happened to the best person ever. You know, the problem with suffering is sometimes stated, why do bad things happen to good people? And the answer is, that's only happened once. Bad things don't happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Maybe it happens to bad people who are trying to be good, bad people who have been forgiven, bad people who are seeking after God and following Jesus. I understand all of that, but we really need to get our heads around the fact that bad things have only happened to good people one time, and that's when they happened to Jesus. The worst thing ever happened to the best person ever, the only innocent sufferer that there has ever been. And it happened so that we, who are evil, can one day go to a place where every tear will be wiped away. God's answer to the problem of evil is the cross of Jesus, where God suffered to one day remove evil once and for all, to provide us forgiveness of our evil in our lives, and to pave the path to that place where suffering will be no more. Well, as we conclude all of this, I want to spend a moment here talking about something a little bit more pragmatic, because that's all, well, that's great and everything. I like those thoughts. I don't know, maybe you don't like those thoughts. Maybe I'm being too self-aggrandizing here, but, that's fine. What you say is nice and everything, but how does that help me right now? That's kind of where does the rubber meet the road sort of thing that we get sometimes. What do we do as we suffer in our lives now? Well, let me suggest to you just two ideas. One is to think about this in terms of the value of lament. The Bible repeatedly shows us faithful people going to God in lamentation. They don't pretend like suffering isn't real. They don't put on a fake happy face for God when they don't feel that way. They go to God and complain. And there are more psalms of lament than there are any other kind of psalm in the entire Psalter. There are prophets who lament. There are historical books that contain lament. There's an entire book of the Bible called the Laments, or Lamentations, we typically call it. Jesus laments. Paul laments. It's everywhere. And it only makes sense because honesty requires that our prayers are transparent. I mean, if you're going through suffering and you're going through misery and every waking moment is agony, and you pause in the midst of that to say, oh, dear God, you're so wonderful and you've blessed me in so many ways and everything's so great, and on and on with this fake prayer that does not represent who you are and what you're thinking. In Jesus' name, amen. Oh, man, I hate my life. Everything's so terrible as soon as you say amen. I don't know. When your kid comes to you and tells you something that is not an accurate representation of reality, the word for that we use is lie. That's what it is. And I think sometimes in a misguided attempt to be reverent, we lie to God about how we feel. The Bible is not filled with so many examples of lament because we should ignore that and never pray that way. When you read the Psalms of lament, they say things to God that make us uncomfortable. I could never pray like that. Well, maybe we should learn to. Maybe that's why they're there, is to show us it's okay to be honest with God. This is its own large topic. Tyler mentioned yesterday the Florida College Lectures. This past year, I did a full lecture on the issue of lament, the topic of lament. There's a lot to say about this. But for now, what I'd say is simply be honest with God. I don't mean be blasphemous to God. I don't mean hurl accusations heavenward. I mean be honest with God about how you feel and what you're enduring and how you're suffering. Because that's what faithful people have done for centuries. And it is biblically attested in the inspired writings. When you suffer, go to God in your lamentation. And then the second thing that I would say as we think about this is that as much as we might like answers, as much as we might want answers, as much as we might almost demand answers at times, answers aren't always the most important thing. When we suffer, what we need is endurance. What we want is escape. But what we need is endurance. And sometimes we're okay to endure as long as we think we're going to get that answer down the road. I don't know about you, but I can't count the number of times in my life I've sung, "Farther along, we'll know all about it. Farther along, we'll understand why." I don't know that the Bible ever promises us that. We have fantasies about get to heaven and ask God this question, or ask Paul that question, or ask Peter this other question. And I don't know that we're ever going to have those conversations. Sure, it's a fine little thing to think about. There's nothing wrong with, oh, I'd like to know this, or I'd like to know that. But I don't think that's what the Bible ever promises. That one day God will set us on his knee and explain everything to us in such a way that it makes so much perfect sense that then we'll be okay with it. I don't see that anywhere. You know what you see instead in the book of Job is Job saying, "I know that my Redeemer lives." And as he works through that great confession of faith in chapter 19, where he ends is not that, "and then I will understand everything." It's "then I will see God." And Job's confession of faith and confidence is concluded not with what he will understand, but with what he will see. And the fact that he will be with God, and that will be enough to satisfy Job. Paul says something very similar when he says that the sufferings, the present sufferings, aren't worth comparing to the answers God will give us one day. No, it almost sounds stupid when you say that, doesn't it? The present sufferings aren't worth compared to the explanation. No, the present sufferings aren't worth being compared to the glory that will be revealed. And understand that what Paul's saying here is not that when you put them side by side on a scale, it's going to so overweigh it that you'll understand. No, Paul's saying there's no purpose in getting the scale out. They're not worth comparing. Not when you compare them, it's overwhelming. They're not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed. The biblical answer seems to be that when we are in God's presence and see him in his glory, and not just that, but as John tells us in his first epistle, we will be made like him, for we will see him as he is. That glory that is to be revealed. That when we experience that, we won't care about the sufferings anymore. We won't want an explanation anymore. Because the scale's tucked away somewhere else. There's a story that I like to tell about this that I think makes the point really well. It comes from my father's childhood, actually. I mentioned my dad's parents. yesterday, time before, I don't remember when it was, but I mentioned them in passing at some point. What I didn't say is that was in the northwest corner of Arkansas in the Ozarks. My dad was born in the mid-40s, and it was impoverished country at that time. This was, after electricity and indoor plumbing and, going to the hospital and stuff, and my dad was born in his home where there was an outhouse. And this was impoverished country. And they didn't have money. They didn't have much money. In fact, when they wanted to celebrate some special occasion, they would do that by my grandfather taking the kids down to the corner store and buying each of them a grape knee-high. Now, if you have no idea what that is, that's basically grape Fanta in a bottle, glass bottle. That's the idea. But again, that kind of tells you something, right? About a special occasion, you get a bottle of soda. That's where they were in the socioeconomic ladder. Well, my dad at some point began to collect the bottle caps from those special occasion days. And he kept them in a box, and because he was a kid and kids do these things, he carried that box around with him everywhere he went. Well, one day he's walking through the house with his box of bottle caps, and he tripped on something, and the box goes flying, and the lid comes off, and it lands in the perfect spot that all of them go dumping down the vent that's letting up the heat from the furnace. Now, they don't go into the furnace and melt away to nothing, but they are down there trapped. And like most fathers, my grandfather thought, that's not worth my time. He'll be fine. And my dad was inconsolable. This is the most precious possession of his life, and he just lost it and can't get it back. And he cried until finally my grandfather broke down and got out the tools and opened things up and got it back for him. Now, I don't know what you think about a collection of bottle caps and its relative value. You may be a very pragmatic person and say that's completely ridiculous that you would cry so much over little pieces of metal. You may be a very sentimental person and say, well, they're very special from very special moments. Wherever you fall on that spectrum, I think we can all acknowledge that losing your mind over a collection of bottle caps is a little excessive. And in fact, my dad thinks that now as well. He looks back at this and says, yeah, however special they might have been, completely losing your mind over this, they're not of that much value. And beyond that, the only reason he even knows the story is because he heard his parents tell it so many times. You have stories like that in your life? You know the story really well, backward and forward. You were there, you participated, but you were so small you don't remember it. You know it because they told it. Think about this for a second. Here is something that was once of such great value to him that he was inconsolable over the loss, and now he thinks it really wasn't that big of a deal. This was something that was so traumatic to him that he was inconsolable over it, and now he can't even remember it, except that he was told about it. What if the worst day that we ever lived? What if the worst season in our life? What if the most immense suffering we ever endure, when we get to heaven, will be nothing but a collection of bottle caps? That we wonder how it is that we could have ever been so upset. That is, if we can remember it at all. That when we are made like him and we see the glory that is to be revealed, it's not worth comparing. This is what Jesus has paved the way for us. Thank you so much for your kind attention this morning.